A nightclub built for laughter became in less time than it takes to order a drink, the deadliest few minutes inside any building in the history of the country, and almost nobody who walked through its doors that evening had any reason to believe they would not be walking back out the same way they came in. Boston in the final weeks of that autumn was a city trying to remember what ordinary felt like, a city where the country had been at war for almost a year, where ration books had replaced the easy abundance everyone still talked about over coffee, and where young men in uniform filled every train platform and street corner on their way somewhere they would rather not think about too closely. People needed somewhere to forget for a few hours, somewhere loud enough and warm enough to make the war feel briefly far away. And few places in the city did forgetting as well as the club tucked behind Piedmont Street, a low-slung building that promised a tropical escape without anyone ever having to leave New England. Painted palm fronds curled gently along the walls of its dining room, fake coconut shells hung from the light fixtures and cast a soft amber glow over every table, and a retractable section of roof above the main floor once let guests look up at real stars on warmer nights as if the whole building were quietly in on its own fantasy. Waiters moved quickly between tables dressed for a tropical evening that had nothing to do with the cold pressing against the windows outside, and a live band played late enough that people often lost track of how long they had been there. The building had not started life as anything glamorous, having spent its earliest years as a plain garage and then briefly as a film distribution warehouse, before someone realized that Bostonians thirsty for entertainment during the years of Prohibition would pay handsomely for a hidden room and a strong drink poured without questions asked. It became one of the city's better-known speakeasies, a place where the right knock on the right door bought access to a world the law officially pretended did not exist, and the architecture of secrecy from that era never really left the building once liquor became legal again. Doors that once needed to stay concealed from police raids were bricked over or simply bolted shut and never reopened, because nobody saw a reason to spend money undoing what had kept the business alive for so long without anyone outside ever knowing how. By the time war broke out, the club belonged to a sharp young lawyer who understood the value of friends in high places far better than he understood the value of a working fire extinguisher. He had connections that ran through the courthouse, through the licensing board that was supposed to inspect his building, and through the kind of social circles that made officials look the other way without anyone needing to say so out loud. He had taken over the club only a few years earlier during leaner financial times, expanding it room by room as money slowly allowed, adding new lounges and bar areas almost as fast as carpenters could finish them. And that piecemeal growth meant the building never functioned as one coherent, carefully planned structure so much as a cluster of smaller rooms stitched together over time, each addition solving a business problem without anyone stopping to ask what new escape problem it might be creating in the process. Under his ownership, the club had become the place where servicemen took their dates before shipping out, where business deals were closed over rounds of drinks rather than across any boardroom table, and where Saturday nights regularly drew a crowd far beyond anything the building had ever been designed to hold. That capacity was not a small detail, even if almost nobody enforcing it seemed to treat it that way. City records allowed somewhere between 460 and 500 guests inside at any given time, a number based on careful calculations about how many people could reasonably move through the available doors if something ever went seriously wrong. Numbers like that existed in cities all over the country by then, written into local codes after smaller fires elsewhere had already raised quiet alarms that mostly went unheeded once the headlines faded, and nightclub owners everywhere had learned the same lesson the easy way long before this particular city would be forced to learn it the hard way. The dining room sat on the ground floor alongside a ballroom and a bandstand, and a maze of smaller, more intimate lounges branched off from it in every direction, each one decorated to keep the tropical fantasy going. Below all of that, tucked under the building like an afterthought, sat a cramped little bar known for its dim lighting, its piano player, and the easy intimacy that came from feeling slightly hidden away from everything happening upstairs. Defense work had brought real money into the city by then, shipyard wages and factory overtime that young men and women were eager to spend somewhere that felt nothing like the job they had just left behind. And nightlife across Boston was booming in a way that made owners reluctant to ever turn a paying customer away at the door. Inspectors had walked through the club more than once over the years, noting problems with exits and decoration that, on paper, were supposed to be corrected before another night of business continued. Each time, the same problem seemed to creep right back into place once the inspector's car had pulled away, and nobody in a position of real authority ever forced the issue hard enough to actually change anything. None of the people enjoying themselves in that basement room on an ordinary Saturday night had any reason to look up and wonder what was holding the ceiling together, or to ask what the soft fabric draped across it might do if it ever met a spark. The decorations that made the club feel so enchanting were, in language nobody in that room would have used at the time, an accelerant waiting only for an excuse, and the building's entire layout, charming as it felt from the inside, had been arranging itself toward disaster for years before anyone struck a match. Earlier that same day, a few miles away at Fenway Park, a football game had ended in a way almost nobody watching had expected. The home team had gone into the matchup undefeated and already being courted for an invitation to a major postseason bowl, and the city had planned to celebrate accordingly that evening. Instead, the supposed underdogs delivered one of the most lopsided defeats either school had ever handed the other, and the victory party that had been planned for the club that night was called off before it ever began. Even the city's own mayor, who had intended to spend the evening there himself, surrounded by celebration, changed his plans the moment the final score came across the wire. What might reasonably have emptied the club out instead filled it further, because thousands of fans with an evening suddenly free and nowhere specific to be turned themselves toward the same string of night spots downtown, and the club behind Piedmont Street was still cheerfully accepting new arrivals long after most other venues in the city had turned their lights down and stopped seating anyone new. By early evening, the building was already well past any sensible capacity. Coats checked 3 and 4 deep in a cloakroom built for a fraction of that number, and by the time the headlining act was due on stage, somewhere well over 1,000 people were pressed into a building meant to comfortably hold less than half that many. The crowd that night was a cross-section of wartime Boston in miniature, the kind of mixture a documentary camera would love if cameras like that had existed yet. There were sailors on leave who had probably never set foot somewhere this dressed up before in their lives, a newly married couple celebrating in the kind of finery people save for exactly one occasion, families marking a homecoming or a birthday with a dinner they had been looking forward to all week. For many of the young couples scattered through the building that night, an evening at a club like this one was itself a small act of wartime courage, a deliberate decision to dress up and feel ordinary together before letters and long separations took over their lives again on Monday morning. And nobody in that crowded room was thinking about fire codes or floor plans, only about each other, about the war finally feeling a little further away, and about how good the band sounded after a few hours of good company and good drinks. Cigarette smoke hung in a soft haze over every table by that hour. The band kept working through requests shouted up from the floor by guests who refused to let the night end early, and the noise of conversation, laughter, and clinking glasses had reached the particular volume that only happens once a room has been full for several hours straight. Coat check girls had long since run out of hangers and were stacking furs and heavy overcoats on any available shelf. Waiters squeezed sideways between packed tables with trays held overhead, and more than one couple found themselves sharing a table with total strangers simply because there was nowhere else left to sit. It felt, to almost everyone there that night, like exactly the kind of night people would talk about for weeks afterward, just not for the reason any of them imagined. Down in that intimate little basement lounge away from the noise and crush of the main room above, a young couple wanted a few private minutes together and unscrewed the bulb nearest their table, leaving their corner of the room pleasantly dim in a way that felt romantic rather than ominous. It was an unremarkable thing to do in a room built for exactly that kind of atmosphere, and under almost any other circumstances it would have stayed completely unremarkable for the rest of the evening. A teenage busboy making his way through the crowded lounge noticed the darkened corner, and, wanting only to be helpful to 2 customers he had never met before and would never see again, reached up toward the empty socket to twist the bulb back into place. Unable to see clearly enough in the gloom to find it, he struck a match to give himself a few seconds of light, never once imagining what that small, ordinary flame was about to find above his head. What happened across the next several minutes would later be studied by fire scientists for decades, because almost nothing about it followed the pace anyone in that crowded room would have expected from a fire. The small flame brushed against the cloth covering one of the artificial palm trees hanging near the ceiling, and for a few seconds it looked almost charming rather than dangerous. A tiny orange flicker that a few amused onlookers tried to swat out with their bare hands or douse with whatever liquid happened to be sitting on their table, including a seltzer bottle that someone grabbed half as a joke between sips of their drink. The amusement lasted only as long as it took the flame to find the false fabric ceiling stretched above the entire room. A thin decorative layer hung just beneath the actual plywood roof to create a softer, more intimate feel for guests below. That narrow hidden gap between the cloth and the wood above it behaved exactly like a wick, pulling fire sideways across the whole ceiling in roughly the time it takes to walk briskly from one end of a room to the other. And once that fire reached the narrow stairwell leading up toward the main floor, the stairs themselves became something closer to a chimney, drawing flame upward with a force that had nothing to do with how large the fire actually was, and everything to do with simple physics nobody sitting in that basement that night had ever studied. Within what witnesses later estimated as only 2 to 4 minutes from that first spark, flame had already reached the building's main entrance. A single revolving door facing the street outside with no ordinary hinged door standing beside it as a backup in case something jammed. A handful of people from the basement lounge managed to push their way through and out onto the cold sidewalk before the rest of the crowd caught up behind them. And for those first fortunate few, the door worked exactly as its designers had intended. Then the sheer weight of dozens of people trying to force their way through at the very same moment jammed its rotation completely, turning the only obvious way out of the entire building into something closer to a solid wall of frightened, struggling bodies. What made those same minutes even crueler was how little any of it could be felt anywhere else in the building at first. One floor above, surrounded by music and conversation and the particular warmth of a packed room on a winter night, guests in the main dining area had no sense whatsoever that anything below them had changed. A fire that scientists would later describe almost as an explosion in slow motion was already climbing toward them through a stairwell most of them had never once looked at twice, and the gap between complete normalcy and complete catastrophe for the people sitting closest to that staircase would ultimately be measured in seconds rather than minutes. It is a strange thing to picture now, an entire room full of people laughing at a joke or ordering one more round, with no possible way of knowing that the floor beneath their feet had already decided how the rest of their evening, and for hundreds of them the rest of their lives, was going to end. Upstairs, in the main dining room where most of the night's guests had absolutely no idea that anything was wrong only moments earlier, flame and smoke arrived with almost no warning at all. Lights throughout the building failed within seconds of each other, plunging a room full of strangers into near-total darkness, while a rolling wall of heat and smoke advanced toward them from a direction many of them could not even properly identify in the panic. People who had been laughing over cocktails and watching a stage performance just moments before were suddenly trying to navigate an unfamiliar maze of overturned chairs, abandoned tables, and other terrified guests they could no longer see clearly in front of them.
The building's own design turned what should have been a manageable, orderly evacuation into something closer to a trap built from years of small, careless decisions.
The same retractable roof that had felt so charming on warm summer evenings was sealed shut for the winter months, removing what might otherwise have been an obvious escape route straight up and out of the smoke. Side doors that existed mainly for kitchen staff had been left locked out of plain habit. An alley exit at the rear of the building had reportedly been bolted shut that very night for reasons nobody could later fully explain, and at least one additional doorway had been concealed so thoroughly behind decorative paneling that even regular patrons sometimes struggled to remember exactly where it was. In one narrow corridor connecting the lobby to a smaller bar area, a large ventilating fan mounted near the ceiling appears to have done precisely the opposite of its intended job that night, actively pulling smoke and flame along the passage instead of helping to clear it away from fleeing guests. Survivors who lived to describe those minutes years later consistently spoke of a fire that did not behave the way fire was supposed to behave, rolling along the ceiling in fast-moving sheets rather than rising gently the way a campfire might, filling lungs with thick black smoke before skin had even fully registered the heat, and turning a building that had taken years to lovingly decorate into something completely unrecognizable in less time than most people take to finish an ordinary dinner. Down in the basement, the same narrow stairway that had funneled flame upward only minutes earlier now funneled desperate, choking people in the opposite direction, climbing directly toward the very fire that had started below them simply because it remained, however briefly and however terribly, the only path back toward the surface that anyone down there could remember. A sailor who had spent the evening across the room from his date later remembered grabbing the hand of a stranger rather than lose her in the dark, pulling her toward a doorway he only half remembered seeing earlier in the night. A young mother near the back wall pressed a napkin over her child's small face and pushed forward through people twice her size simply because stopping was no longer an option. Once the crowd behind her started moving, these were the kinds of small, instinctive decisions made by hundreds of people at once, and almost none of them with any real information about what was actually happening, that ultimately decided who walked back out into the cold that night and who did not. By most careful later estimates, the entire unfolding disaster, from the instant that single-match first touched cloth to the moment the building had become fully and hopelessly engulfed, took somewhere close to 8 to 12 minutes from beginning to end, a span of time genuinely difficult to overstate, shorter than a single television episode without its commercial breaks, shorter than most people's daily commute to work, and yet long enough for an ordinary evening of music, dinner, and laughter to become the worst single-building fire that most people in that city would ever witness across their entire lifetimes. Many of those who did not survive were found later without any visible burns at all, victims instead of the thick superheated smoke that filled the building's lower rooms long before any flame ever physically reached them, a detail that would later change how doctors and firefighters alike thought about what actually kills people inside a structure fire. A few streets away, firefighters from a nearby engine company had, by sheer coincidence, just finished extinguishing a minor car fire when a passerby came running toward them shouting that something far larger was happening at the club around the corner. They arrived within minutes to find a building from which flame was already pouring through every window and doorway facing the street, and what greeted them at the main entrance was a scene that even veteran firefighters would describe for the rest of their careers as something closer to a battlefield than any ordinary structure fire they had ever responded to before. Additional companies were called in rapidly from across the city, ladder crews breaking through walls and boarded over windows with axes to create new openings where none had existed. Minutes earlier, while other crews searched blindly through smoke-filled rooms for anyone still left alive inside. The revolving door, the very same one that had allowed the first lucky handful of guests to escape only minutes earlier, was now packed almost solid with the bodies of people who had been crushed trying to force their way through it together rather than waiting their turn one at a time. Rescue crews worked steadily through the night, pulling victims from doorways, narrow stairwells, and corners of the building that had once held nothing more dangerous than tables and chairs, while ambulances and even hastily commandeered taxicabs ferried the injured toward the city's hospitals in a long, grim procession that did not slow down until well past dawn the following morning. Nearby buildings, a garage, a church hall, anywhere with enough open floor space were pressed into service as makeshift gathering points for the dead, because no single facility in the city had ever been built to receive that many bodies at once. Volunteers who had never expected to spend their Saturday night this way found themselves helping carry stretchers and cover faces, working alongside strangers in a kind of grim, unspoken partnership that the rest of the city would talk about for years. Throughout the early hours of the morning, a steady stream of husbands, wives, parents, and friends arrived at hospital doors and makeshift gathering halls alike, working their way down hastily typed lists of names in the dim light, hoping for one name and dreading every other possibility the list represented. When the toll was finally and carefully counted in the days that followed, it stood at nearly 500 dead and well over 100 more seriously injured, instantly making it the deadliest fire ever to strike a nightclub anywhere in the country, a grim record that, even all these decades later, no other disaster of its specific kind has come close to matching anywhere in the world. The city's two largest hospitals, one a respected teaching hospital affiliated with a major university, and the other the city's primary public hospital, found themselves flooded with burn victims in numbers that neither institution had ever remotely prepared for, arriving faster than exhausted doctors could properly examine each new patient coming through the doors. Many of the injuries were unlike anything most physicians on duty that particular night had ever been trained to treat, severe burns combined with smoke inhalation that caused the body to lose fluid at a dangerous and largely unpredictable rate, pushing patient after patient toward a state of medical shock that doctors at the time did not yet fully understand how to anticipate or prevent. In response, physicians at both hospitals began administering donated blood plasma, a treatment barely a few years old and still being actively refined even as it was being used on real patients that night, adjusting dosages almost in real time as they learned something new from each new case brought through the doors. Doctors moved from bed to bed comparing notes as the night wore on, essentially developing protocol on the fly that hospitals elsewhere would later study and adopt, because nothing in their existing training had prepared anyone for treating this many severe burns at once inside a single building. Nurses and surgeons who had expected nothing more than a quiet Saturday shift instead worked without meaningful rest through the smallest hours of the morning, comforting frightened, exhausted families who arrived searching for relatives long before anyone on staff could tell them with any real certainty who among the missing had actually survived. In the weeks that followed, investigators worked very carefully to determine exactly what had allowed a small, almost harmless flame to become a full catastrophe within a matter of minutes. The teenage busboy who had struck that match was quickly and very publicly cleared of any meaningful blame, with the state's own fire marshal stating plainly to reporters that the boy could not reasonably be held responsible for everything that followed his small, ordinary action, a verdict that mattered enormously to a young man who would otherwise have carried that weight for the rest of his life. Attention instead turned toward the building's outdated and likely faulty wiring, hidden behind walls and ceilings patched and repainted so many times over the years that nobody could say with certainty what condition it had actually been in. And decades later, researchers also identified a flammable refrigerant gas used somewhere in the building's cooling systems that may have leaked unnoticed and helped explain just how violently and how quickly the fire ultimately spread once it first caught hold. The club's owner faced by far the heaviest consequences of anyone connected to the disaster, and the public mood throughout his trial left no doubt about how the city felt toward him. Crowds gathered outside the courthouse hoping for a glimpse of the man whose locked doors and ignored warnings had, in the eyes of nearly everyone reading the newspapers that winter, turned an ordinary night out into a mass grave. He was convicted on 19 separate counts of manslaughter and sentenced to more than a decade behind bars, a punishment that reflected just how directly his own choices, locked emergency doors, openly ignored capacity limits, and decorations that never should have passed any honest inspection, had contributed to the staggering scale of what happened that night. He ultimately served only a portion of that sentence before being released early on health grounds, and he died of illness not long after walking free. In a smaller but still symbolic gesture, city licensing authorities permanently banned any future business from ever using the club's old name again, ensuring it could never simply rebuild and reopen under the same identity once the public shock eventually faded. The more lasting impact, however, reached far beyond any single trial or any single sentence. Cities and states across the entire country rewrote their fire codes almost immediately afterward, requiring that revolving doors be flanked on either side by ordinary hinge doors that could never jam shut under crowd pressure, mandating clearly illuminated exit signs in any public venue regardless of size, banning the kind of flammable decorative materials that had turned one charming nightclub into kindling within minutes, and enforcing occupancy limits with an urgency that had never really existed in quite the same way before that particular night. New rules also required that doors swing freely outward under the push of a crowd rather than needing to be pulled open, a tiny mechanical detail that on an ordinary night nobody would ever think twice about, and that on the wrong night could be the entire difference between an evacuation and a tragedy.
Walk into almost any theater, restaurant, or nightclub today and the visible safety features most people rarely even consciously notice: the steadily glowing exit signs, the doors built to swing outward under pressure rather than inward, the sprinkler heads dotting the ceiling above every table, trace their existence and their legal requirement directly back to lessons that an entire city paid for in one building on one night.
The medical response left behind its own quiet but lasting legacy as well. Surgeons who treated the burn victims that winter eventually published detailed findings on precisely how much fluid a severely burned patient actually needs in order to survive the dangerous earliest hours after such an injury. Calculations based largely on careful observation of how the survivors from that single night responded to treatment over their following days and weeks in the hospital. That work became a foundational reference point for emergency medicine, and that doctors treating burn patients still draw upon today, decades after the men who first wrote it down have long since passed away, and it would go on to help save the lives of countless wounded soldiers returning from battlefields only a few years later. Perhaps the least expected legacy of all belonged not to architecture or to emergency medicine but to psychiatry, where a doctor at one of the hospitals treating survivors began systematically interviewing people who had lost spouses, siblings, and close friends that night, listening closely to the patterns in how each of them grieved, the quiet guilt many of them carried for having survived when someone sitting right beside them had not, and the specific emotional stages their sorrow seemed to move through over the following weeks and months. He noticed that grief which was denied, postponed, or never properly expressed tended to resurface later in far more damaging ways, an observation that reshaped how an entire profession understood loss. His careful research became one of the founding studies in the modern understanding of grief and trauma, laying groundwork that would later inform how doctors recognize and treat what the world now commonly calls post-traumatic stress, and his methods are still taught to students entering the field today. For the city itself, the disaster never entirely faded the way most local news eventually does, and for years afterward, almost everyone in Boston could name a relative, a neighbor, or a coworker who had either been inside that night or had a ticket they never used because plans changed at the last minute. Survivors carried the story into the decades that followed, told and retold at kitchen tables long after the rubble had been cleared and new buildings had risen on the same ground, until what had once been a single terrible night slowly became something closer to civic memory, a story every generation of the city seemed to inherit, whether they asked for it or not. More than 60 years later, a nightclub fire in Rhode Island would kill exactly the kind of crowd this earlier disaster had spent decades warning the country about, trapped by blocked exits and flammable stage decorations under circumstances that felt almost eerily familiar to anyone who knew the older story well. It served as a quiet, uncomfortable reminder that lessons carefully written into a building code can still be slowly forgotten by the very people who are supposed to keep enforcing them generation after generation. The site where the original club once stood looks nothing at all like it did that night, long since swallowed by newer construction and marked only by a small plaque that most passers-by never even notice as they hurry past. But the doors people walk through every single day without a second thought, the ones built to swing outward instead of jamming shut without warning, and the exit signs glowing steadily above their heads in every restaurant, theater, and nightclub they will ever visit for the rest of their lives, carry forward permanently and without fanfare the true cost of everything the country was forced to learn in those 8 or so unbearable minutes one wartime November, paid for by hundreds of people who only wanted one ordinary night out together and never once imagined it would be their last.